Hello, everyone. I'm Brent Mitchell with the Quebec Labrador Foundation. Welcome to episode 1 of season 2 of our webinar series, Voices of QLF. Before we begin, I'd like to let you know that this 1-hour episode is being recorded and will be posted on QLF's website. With a lot of material to cover, we won't be able to respond to questions, though feel free to make comments in the chat. And now I'd like to introduce QLF President Beth Alling, who will serve as the moderator of today's episode.
Thank you, Brent. Today, our distinguished webinar panelists are recognized as some of the best in the field. It is a great privilege and honor to welcome Sue Stolton and Nigel Dudley of Equilibrium Research based in the UK, and Brent Mitchell, QLF Senior Vice President here in Massachusetts. Business partners since 1991, Sue and Nigel have authored more than 200 books and reports on conservation and have held special assignments and partnerships with 70 countries and organizations worldwide. Both are essential in the International Union for Conservation of Nature, or IUCN, and authors of many of the IUCN's authoritative publications, and they share a special interest in privately protected areas. Sue and Nigel participated remotely in the recent IUCN World Conservation Congress in Marseille, France, the subject of our webinar today. And of course, I'm very pleased to have Brent Mitchell as a panelist today. As many of you know, Brent has served with QLF for over 35 years and has directed many of the organization's international conservation exchanges and special assignments in region and around the world. Brent attended the recent World Conservation Congress in his role as chair of a specialist group on privately protected areas and nature stewardship. At this time, I'd like to ask Brent to set the context for this webinar by providing a brief overview of the IUCN and the World Conservation Congress.
The International Union for Conservation of Nature is the largest nature conservation organization in the world. Based in Switzerland, it is, quote, a democratic union that brings together the world's most influential organizations and top experts in a combined effort to conserve nature and accelerate the transition to sustainable development. More than 18,000 experts serve through 6 commissions. The 3 of us, Sue, Nigel, and I, are most active in the World Commission on Protected Areas. You may have heard of the Red List of Endangered Species, a core knowledge product of the Species Survival Commission. IUCN is rather unique in being a membership organization. IUCN staff get their direction from more than 1,400 institutional members, both government and non-governmental. Those directions come every 4 years when the members meet in the World Conservation Congress. The 2020 Congress was delayed by a year, but was held in early September in Marseille, France. The Congress begins with a technical forum of workshops and presentations. Then the member organizations vote on a program of work and policy resolutions. Members adopted 148 resolutions or recommendations, 39 through a vote at the Congress in Marseille, and 109 through online voting prior to the event. These ranged from big and ambitious: protect 80% of the Amazon region by 2025, halt deep sea mining, adopt a One Health approach, and policy on synthetic biology, to some very specific and targeted resolutions: keep Peru's Marañón River wild, withdraw Dutch fossil fuel permits beneath the Wadden Sea World Heritage Site, and protect the Okavango River basin of Southwest Africa from oil and gas exploitation. The Congress made important decisions for IUCN and its members to take up, but in many ways it was also preparatory to more binding commitments to be made by governments at the upcoming conferences of parties to both the Convention on Biological Diversity and the Framework Convention on Climate Change, commonly called the Paris Agreement. The WCC Forum and key IUCN resolutions will inform these imminent treaty negotiations. What's more, the WCC demonstrated that essential conferences like these can be held safely if proper precautions are taken. Now, right up through August, we had doubts whether the in-person event would happen. I expected we might see 2,000 or 3,000 people, mostly from Europe and the US, but people came from all over the world. With 5,700 participants and delegates on site in Marseille, about 3,500 online participants, some 25,000 local visitors from the general public, and just one positive COVID-19 test that we know of. So Beth, over to you.
Thank you so much, Brent. Wonderful. Before we move to our first discussion, I am sure that those of you who have joined with us today would like to know how Brent and Sue and Nigel met and how they formed their working partnerships. Over to you, Sue.
Hi. Well, the first question is fairly easy, how I met Nigel, which is well over 30 years ago. We met working for the Soil Association, which is the Organic Standards Association in the UK, and kind of, I guess, bonded writing guidelines on biodiversity and organic agriculture. And we seem to have been writing guidelines ever since, as well as living together for 30 odd years. And I guess, we formed Equilibrium very much based on that idea that we were looking for kind of practical solutions to conservation problems. And we've been looking for those practical solutions with partners ever since, and some lovely partners, including some of those on the call that I recognise the name of, and Brent as well. I'll pass over to Nigel.
Yes, hi everyone. Well, we'd actually forgotten how we first met, so we just realised before the call we first met Brent and Jessica in the Pump House in Bath, which is actually featured in quite a few Jane Austen novels. It's a very old restaurant right by the Roman baths in the city of Bath in southwest England, when we were recommended to meet by Adrian Phillips, who many of you will know, who past chair of World Commission on Protected Areas. And we've continued meeting and working together ever since. And I think the only thing I'd like to add to that, and it's very relevant to the kind of way we've been living for the last 2 years, and questions about how much we should travel in the future. I mean, the way we've built up a working relationship has been through occasional meetings, and not just sitting on Zoom, and not just work meetings. They've been sitting around in bars, sitting around in restaurants, going for walks together. And that kind of building up of a friendship and a professional understanding is very difficult to do remotely. We're all having to do it, but it makes it much more challenging. I think we're very lucky to be in, those of us old enough to have been traveling and able to meet people around the world. That's been a way we built up a global movement. Brent, please.
Well, I think you guys have said it all, but I would just note that it's been invaluable as we've been leading the IUCN specialist group on privately protected areas and nature stewardship, to have both of you, in particular Sue. I wouldn't do it without Sue. She's really the co-chair of the group, so it's been a very productive and wonderful friendship and partnership.
Thank you. And now let's move on to our first discussion on 30 by 30 and the UN Decade of Ecosystem Restoration. Nigel, we're all encouraged that members of the IUCN have formally endorsed an ambitious and critically important global target for the year 2030. Could you tell us about 3030, its framework and milestones expected over this decade?
Sure. I mean, this is as you say, Beth, it's a big change, and it's really exciting. And it has come out of IUCN. I think the first people talking about this level of ambition of targets for protected and conserved areas was the Wilderness Specialist Group of IUCN, of the World Commission on Protected Areas. I want to step back a bit. IUCN, first of all, proposed the target of 10% of the world to be in protected area and conserved areas around 30 years ago. And it was considered to be crazy. I mean, way ambitious, way more ambitious than we would ever reach. But we've reached that, and we surpassed it. 17% of terrestrial areas was considered unreachable when governments agreed it in Japan 10 years ago, 11 years ago, and it's been reached. So now we have a new exciting target, which is that by the next 9 years, governments will reach 30% of land and 30% of marine in protected and conserved areas. A little bit to say about that. The resolution within our IUCN was important because it shows that governments are behind it. It's also worth noting that over 70 governments have already committed to this target. So although it's a target of the Convention on Biological Diversity, and it's still not certain until we actually have that meeting in China next year, it's got a kind of momentum behind it. Many of the world's most important, powerful countries have already said they're going to do it. So there's something that's going to happen along those lines. Just worth mentioning that we're talking about protected and conserved areas. So one thing that has changed since the first target was proposed was we're not just talking about traditional protected areas, land set aside, national parks. We're also talking about this new group of other effective area-based conservation measures, which we have only recently been defined. We're still working out what they mean. And we don't quite know the way that is developing. So it's exciting and a slightly scary time, but some big ambitious targets. And then the other thing going along beside that is that in June this year, the UN launched a decade on ecosystem restoration, the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. And that's exciting because it's the first time that there's been a big global push towards restoration. In fact, from conservation, NGOs have often been quite reluctant because it's a kind of a mission of failure almost that you need to restore, but we do need to restore in many areas. And so this is ambitious. It's going to generate a lot of words, or hopefully a lot of action, some money, some investment. And it also needs to be managed. We could see bad forms of restoration as well as good forms of restoration. So both these targets are ambitious, they're exciting, but they're also slightly scary. They could go wrong if we don't manage them properly. We'll need to work together to make sure they really have teeth and bite. Sue, over to you.
Thanks. Yeah, and I think to pick up on what Nigel was just closing there on the concept of targets, there's clearly been a lot of, I guess, discussion around how useful targets are. They push people into making commitments and to possibly sort of stating that they're going to, say, protect, for instance, areas that never really come into reality, the so-called kind of paper parks, or even, I guess, worse than that, paper commitments that never even get as far as paper parks. And I've been quite, when we first started talking about the post-2020 agenda, I kind of thought that was a holding name and that we'd come up with something kind of forward-looking. But we're still talking about post-2020 and the post-2020 targets. And I think, you know, one of the reasons for that is that there was a lot of targets up to 2020 and we didn't really reach any of them, although we came pretty close on the protected area targets. And I think in a way we kind of know that we've already squandered the last 10 years in kind of moving forward, but not moving forward fast enough. So the target of moving from 17 to 30% in far less than 10 years now is definitely a challenge. So we definitely have to be careful that it doesn't become just a series of big paper commitments. And I think one of the things that did come out at the World Conservation Congress a little bit, and I think is going to be discussed an awful lot more over the next few years, is that we really need to get our kind of monitoring and indicators better. Part of me thinks, oh God, let's just get on with it. Doesn't matter if we don't know what's happening here or there. Let's just try and, you know, save the world. But if we don't know, you know, where our protected areas are, where the other effective OECMs are, particularly, as Brent mentioned, one of my passions is privately protected areas, and we really don't have those very well recorded in world databases at the moment. So, you know, if we don't start getting this monitoring together, and there was whole sessions on indicators and pulling those together at the WCC, but we're still not really cracking that issue. And I think the other thing that I will just briefly say before passing over to Brent, but an issue that we will come back to anyway, is that one of the nice things to see with that resolution on 30x30 was the support from the indigenous communities for that target. But we'll come back to talk about those communities a bit more later on.
Yeah, and I would just add to that we won't know what the final verdict is until next spring, but there's more underneath the commitment than just 30% on a map somewhere. That there's a lot of language about it being effective and equitable, about it being interconnected, so there's a good deal more science and foundation into what we hope will be a fairly robust commitment that nations will make, not just 30% of whatever. And another change I think that we'll see is somehow the 2020 commitment, as Sue mentioned, was 17% of terrestrial and 10% marine. And somewhere along the line, that was interpreted to mean that every country was to protect that percentage, where there's nothing in the convention that says that. So I think there's a push that the number, which is already ambitious, be targeted to specific areas where biodiversity is highest or most vulnerable. So we'll see a lot of that. The spring is just the beginning when these commitments get made. And then the real work, the technical work begins of having the standards and the capacity to monitor that it's really happening. And of course the political will and the economic drivers to actually make sure it happens.
Thank you so much. So our second discussion is climate action and nature-based solutions. And I'll turn this over to you, Sue, for your comments.
Hi again. So yes, I mean, obviously we're so close now to the COP26 in Glasgow that I think a lot of the discussions around climate are already happening or have happened. But obviously it was a major theme of the World Conservation Congress and has been increasingly. And it's something that we've also seen in our work over 30 years, from something that felt very new when I think the first report we wrote was about sort of 20 or so years ago on this issue, to obviously something now that's so urgent and underscores virtually everything that we do. So one of the things at the World Conservation Congress that was agreed, which I'm not sure is momentous or not, but at the moment there are 6 commissions, voluntary commissions at IUCN, covering the species, the protected areas, law, environmental and social policy, ecosystem management. And there's an agreement to create a new commission on climate, or I think it's called the Climate Emergency or something like that. I was reading a little bit today about the kind of debates around that resolution, which was just actually slightly depressing, because it was quite a lot of debate about what's the best way to make things happen quickly, and what's the best process. And as I think probably most of us know on this call, we're kind of beyond process and need to be into action and actually doing something. So whether that was a momentous decision or not, I'm not really sure. But I think what was more important, and has been, as the video that Brent just showed, has been the increasing importance of seeing nature-based solutions as a way to deal with climate change in all ways. And I think also, and with emergencies in all ways. And, long ago, when this World Conservation Congress was first being planned, we hadn't actually heard of COVID. And it was so well organised that all of the sessions were agreed before COVID appeared. So there was a lot of kind of new material had to be has come up after the initial planning phase. and again has really pushed the fact that we need to use nature-based solutions far more. The One Health Planet process and idea has also, you know, really taken conceptual ground over this, as has, you know, the 30% targets. So I think, you know, obviously climate was a major theme, but everybody's kind of holding their breath for it's only almost a month away, just over a month away now for Glasgow, to see if our politicians to not do what Greta said the other day and say blah blah blah, but actually do something. But anyway, I'll pass over to Nigel to add on to this.
Sure, thanks, Sue. Yeah, I think worth pointing out that in the same way as I said, you know, governments NGOs were reluctant to talk about restoration. They've also initially been reluctant to talk about nature-based solutions as a solution to climate change, because there was concern, there was fear that governments would use that as an excuse for doing nothing about emissions, which is still the real thing we need to tackle. And I have a lot of sympathy with that perspective, because indeed governments have held up their protected areas or held up their forests and said, look what we're doing about climate change, and done nothing about emissions. So it is a danger, but I think now the world recognizes we need to do everything. We need to do both. We need to, whatever we can do to slow this down, it has to be grabbed. So this is a time for nature-based solutions. And again, worth pointing out that this is about both mitigation, about storing carbon and capturing greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere, but also about adaptation and helping us all adapt to the changes that are already here and are going to become worse over time. So we're looking at nature to capture carbon or store the carbon that it's already there. If the peatlands, the world's peatlands, continue to degrade, then, you know, we're all in big trouble. So looking at that, but then also looking at things like disaster risk reduction, from shoreline protection, from river protection, from protection of slopes against avalanche, to management of ecosystems that are going to be under much more stress than they were before. So there's a real role, and an important role for nature, but it's quite complex. And what it will mean is that we have to take that into consideration much more closely as we manage our nature areas, including our protected areas. And there'll be some trade-offs, undoubtedly, between the conventional role of the protected areas to protect biodiversity and their wider role in sequestering carbon and looking at adaptation. And those are the kind of things which managers are going to wrestling with right now, and which are going to become more acute in the future. I think it's also worth saying that a lot of the debate about nature-based solutions as a way of tackling climate change came out of the protected area community. We were the first community to really talk loudly and make a fuss about the role of nature, and the role of the Latin American countries and the Red Parquet's declaration at the Paris Agreement, the Paris Summit a few years ago, was a real game changer, because it was the first time that governments stood up together and made that point that we need to be looking at nature. And they made a number of commitments about extra protected areas, specifically from a climate focus. And that really has fed up through the IPCC, through the UN Framework Convention, and changed the debate. So really, really good ways forward there. Over to you, Brent.
Well, you know, the way we've set up this conversation, the temptation is just to say ditto and what they said. So, you know, I completely agree with everything you guys have said. You know, one thing that I could add is having been in the room when the debate over creating a climate commission with IUCN, it was really a difficult afternoon. It was well, for starters, it's in a huge room with no windows, and everyone's spaced out because of COVID. It's a pretty depressing environment. But it was by far the most debated action that the members took, a couple of hours, I think. And you would think that it would have been, as we say, a slam dunk, because everybody knows we've got to deal with climate. But and it was dragged through all sorts of procedural challenges and that sort of thing, not so much dealing with the merits of IUCN working on climate. Of course they should. The heart of the debate was whether creating a climate convention, a seventh commission, first time they've created a new commission in many, many years, whether that would ghettoize the work on climate, and that shouldn't we all be working on climate? And indeed we should. So there were kind of two camps of whether we should have this commission that would focus on it, or whether we should make sure that climate was central to all of the work. And ultimately, the members decided that we really should have this focal point of a commission. And another comment that I was thinking just as everyone was talking is that we talk about these conventions as separate events. We have the climate convention and the biodiversity convention, but they're really intertwined. 30 by 30 will come under the biodiversity convention, but obviously it'll have huge implications for the climate targets as well. And then there's the third existential threat that we've become familiar with in the last 18 months to 2 years, and that's of public health. And a changing climate will move the creatures that harbor viruses that have the potential to spill over to humans. There are possibly 500,000 such viruses in wild populations. So climate will have an impact on how we protect human health through protected areas and through nature conservation. So it's, politically they're in three different silos. But one of the things that IUCN and similar organizations are going to need to do is figure out how to coordinate and how to make the connections that are obvious when you think about it.
Thank you so much. Now, our third discussion is human rights and the engagement of Indigenous communities in global conservation. I'd like to turn this over to you, Brent. I know this is very important to you, as it is to Sue and Nigel.
Yeah, thanks, Beth. I started my career in an era when a fortress park mentality really dominated conservation and protected areas. I spent a year living in and setting up the first 2 national parks in Haiti, designed to protect some of the last remaining natural forests in that greatly overpopulated country. The conservation need was obvious, but I learned firsthand what folly it can be to ignore the needs of local people and to try to keep them out of designated protected areas without any engagement or benefit sharing. Now, there are certainly areas that are so sensitive that human use must be restricted or eliminated, but in far larger areas, conservationists are learning to engage local people in solutions rather than always viewing them as the problem. It's not entirely new, but it's been growing across the movement, and more people are beginning to see this reality. And that's especially true of how we relate to indigenous communities. Estimates are that they account for only 5% of the global population of people, yet protect approximately 80% of the world's biodiversity. And most have been taking care of their places for hundreds to thousands of years longer than others have. Our specialist group on privately protected areas, and indeed the focus on governance that drives that, was really, starting to look at the what is rather more than the what that's being protected, but to the who is doing the protecting in protected areas. And that shift in focus was really driven by the demands, really, of indigenous groups to be recognized for what they already do and to be enlisted as partners in meeting the conservation goals that science tells us we have to achieve to protect ourselves. And QLF as an institution is very committed to this. We're a founding member of a consortium of indigenous and community conserved areas. Though we do not ourselves represent indigenous people, we wanted to support the effort. And it's really growing globally. Unfortunately, we're still the only member of the consortium in the continental United States, but we hope to change that soon. Many IUCN resolutions affirmed that conservation must be both effective and equitable. There were many that instruct IUCN and others to engage with indigenous peoples, including internally. A governance resolution to create the first IUCN counselor position, essentially the board of IUCN, a new position elected to be representing indigenous peoples, alongside those counselors that represent geographic regions. And the last World Conservation Congress in Hawaii expanded the IUCN membership to include not only governments and NGOs, but also IPOs, indigenous peoples organizations. And by the way, while I'm talking about internal changes for IUCN, other governance decisions were the election of more women to leadership, including the second female president, only the second since IUCN began in 1948. And another allows for subnational governments to become members of IUCN. Now, Massachusetts, Quebec, Catalonia, and others can apply for membership. This is all to the good. And I think I'm turning it over to Nigel.
Oh, okay. Yes, well, that's the good side, and there is lots of good. We've also got some serious problems to address in this issue, in this area. I mean, we have conservation organizations have had mounting criticism for mistreatment of indigenous people. It's now a very sensitive issue. As some of you may know, there was a kind of counter conference going on just before the World Conservation Congress, basically saying we shouldn't have 30%, against the 30% target that we argued against, we mentioned earlier. And there's been a number of very well publicized issues of serious breakdown of trust, of abuse by rangers. I think they're a tiny proportion of what happens, but of course they get a lot of publicity. We also have a longer term problem that some governments have continued to practice a kind of fortress conservation, and there've been continuing expulsions of people from protected areas and so on. So we've got a breakdown of trust, and we've got a few years. Hopefully, we still have a few years to rebuild that, because one of the potential tragedies of this is that indigenous people and conservation organizations, who both basically want the same thing in most cases, are pulling apart, and there's a real risk of a complete breakdown of communication and trust. As Sue said, the indigenous groups supported the 30% target, which was very important and very significant. But not all indigenous groups do. A lot of them are quite worried about that. They're worried about the implications. They're worried, particularly in countries if governments are still moving people out of protected areas, they're worried about what that will mean for their lands. So one of the roles for groups like IUCN is to really engage very strongly in this process over the next few years and make sure that the expansion of the protected and conserved areas doesn't mean the expulsion of people from their land or doesn't mean loss of human rights. And Sue and I have been doing quite a lot of work on safeguarding for various NGOs at the moment. A lot of groups are taking it much more seriously than they were even recently. So I also think that we need to engage with Indigenous people increasingly, not just as a bloc. And it does worry me quite a lot that we tend to talk about Indigenous people as if they're always going to be the same, you know, and they're not, because they're like us. There's a big variety. In the meetings we've had with Indigenous and local communities in the last few years, for example, I've always asked about whether they've seen impacts of climate change, and some people will come out and say, yeah, and they'll have really detailed information. They'll say, we've got new birds coming in we didn't have before. Fishermen will have new fish. People will be seeing very precisely the changes in flowering season or in their crops. Other ones, you know, they really don't notice, or they notice things that really impact them, but they've only got a vague idea. It's very much like everyone else, of course. So we need to be not engaging as a bloc, and we need to be engaging much more individually, I think. We also need to ramp it up. I mean, IUCN has done some great work, but they have an Indigenous person as looking after Indigenous people's issues, but she's on her own, one lady. She's great. She's from Guatemala. She's an Indigenous person, but she does not have time to engage in everything. So I think there's a message from IUCN that this is a good start, but you need to really ramp up that whole part of the organization. So, you know, it's going to be very exciting and a very interesting time to be working, but we're going to be doing a lot more conversations and working together over the next few years. Sue, you've probably got stuff to add to that.
Sure, yes. I mean, I think, so going back to the Congress itself, though, there were quite a few resolutions around Indigenous peoples and local communities, partly, I think, because of in the previous Congress, you know, and previous Congresses, the issues and the push for greater participation has actually been very, very successfully managed by Indigenous and local communities. So, you know, there was an overarching resolution about, you know, how IUCN needed to work much more closely with Indigenous and local communities on every scale. And I think that the one overarching resolution also specifically mentioned WCPA and in the terms of protected areas. I think, you know, I've often felt, and we were also one of the, I'm not sure if it's founding members or we're honorary members or whatever of the ICCA consortium, but, you know, we've often felt that at these big congresses, it's a kind of a group of, a community of interest talking together to each other, sharing experiences, but that not getting out more widely to the wider, whether it's a World Conservation Congress, a World Parks Congress, the Convention on Biological Diversity meeting. I think that is changing, definitely. And I think the idea of having, it sounds a bit nerdy, but the idea of having Indigenous peoples as a separate membership group within IUCN is actually really interesting, because if you look at the resolutions and the voting results, which you can do, IUCN is pretty open, it's all online. You can look for each of the resolutions, and, you know, as Nigel said, the support for the 30 times 30 was kind of pretty equal between governments and the Indigenous communities, which is very interesting, given, you know, that sort of there was a mass letter from a lot of social groups, sort of, I don't know, 40 or 50 signing it up saying, you know, this is a real problem. So, you know, we can start showing that there is support. So I think that's very interesting. But I also agree with Nigel that, you know, there's an awful lot of issues remaining. And one of the other suggestions that came out of the meeting was about, and I think is embedded in one of the resolutions, I'm not sure, but it's about having a kind of truth and reconciliation working group around some of these issues. It's not a new recommendation. I mean, I remember Gonzalo Oviedo, that some of you may remember back, I can't remember, probably quite a few years ago, recommending that in a publication. So it's not new, and it's, as far as I know, still not something that IUCN has done, but I think would be very, very interesting to actually get, you know, all of these people together on some kind of working group like that, and really kind of nutting it out and seeing what a bigger problem we have. And there was one very interesting resolution about ensuring that countries repealed the doctrine of discovery. which I must admit I had to kind of dig down and find out what that was. And as usual, I should have known more about it, being British, because it's been something in legislation for about 500 and a bit years here, about how it's basically okay to go out and kind of take other people's lands. Started in Roman times, and then the Christianity movement took it over. But there's still an awful lot of things. I mean, the underlying message here, there's a lot of legislation that is still very out of date, that is really hampering this kind of human rights approach to conservation. And we've been involved in IUCN, as Beth said at the beginning, writing an awful lot of best practices of how you should go about managing things. And it's just very depressing that there's still so many, as high up as in national legislation, things that are making these best practices hard to achieve, let alone at site level. So the more we can get the legal systems, behind our conservation more effective, the better. And again, that's something that IUCN, I think, is quite effective in highlighting. But governments and members, and all we can do at World Conservation Congresses and at CBDs is advise governments to do things. But hopefully the advice will go down well this time. Thanks.
Thank you all. And now our concluding remarks from each panelist. And I've got one question for each of you. We'll start with Nigel, to Sue, to Brent. From your perspective, what is the future of conservation, and what are the new trends in global conservation?
Me first. Well, I think it's going to be a much more crowded field than it has in the past, by which I mean more people are involved, and it's not just long-term professionals like us or even long-term volunteers. It's people who until recently haven't thought about conservation. It's not their big thing, it's not their focus, but there's increasing recognition. I've just done or two of us have just done a study for a European government pension fund seeking to potentially disinvest, certainly engage with companies that they invest in that are damaging biodiversity. So over the last few months, we've looked at almost 2,000 companies, one of the most boring jobs I've ever done in my life, but really interesting stuff that's coming out in terms of plodding through many, many different company reports, sustainability reports, seeing what companies are engaging in. And the central message is that lots of companies are engaging with the Sustainable Development Goals. They know about those. Lots of them are engaging with climate change and with recycling. Biodiversity is still pretty low on most companies' agenda. They haven't really engaged with it as much as we tend to think. Some of the things we talk about a lot, like protected areas, key biodiversity areas. I don't think any company in any of the 1,000 or so reports I looked at mentioned key biodiversity areas, which is a big issue for IUCN. I mean, it's a bit, so some messages are getting through, some are not, but I mean, the overall message is there's engagement. It's interesting that a government will be looking at its own pension fund and seeking to disinvest because of environmental issues. That itself is a big step forward. I think that'll be the first of many. It's interesting that companies are taking it seriously. So my message would be that, we're working in a more crowded, more complicated field than we were before. More actors involved, lots of very, very different actors involved. We're working more on a landscape scale than we were before. We're moving away from looking at individual sites, looking much more at a landscape and seascape. And there does seem, I know it's always dangerous to be over optimistic, but there does seem to be a real momentum, which I've never seen before, a recognition that things are bad and a momentum to try and do something about it. Enough from me.
So, I mean, there are so many themes, but I was going to pick up on the kind of the young professionals and the youth stream. There was several concurrent sort of mini conferences before the main WCC, and including a youth summit. And apparently it was completely virtual, but 15,000 people took part in that, which is, one of the great things about doing things virtually, despite, missing having a glass of wine with Brent in Marseille. But I think, if one of the things that COVID has taught us is that we can do more things virtually. Anybody who's, half my age and a lot less is far more conversant with using this technology than we will ever be. So there's a chance to really capture the youth audience. There's, it is not going to be up to us to capture them. It is the young ambassadors, the youth ambassadors, and there are obviously some prominent people that have been coming up through the last 2 years. I mean, the only thing that is a kind of worry is that, again, sort of looking at some of the outcomes of these things, is that the older generation says it's up to the younger generation to do something, and the younger generation says it's up to the older generation to do something. So we just need to make sure that we're all doing something, and I think not blaming, because that doesn't get us anywhere, but definitely supporting. And I think it's, from IUCN's point of view, it's something that we're going to have to grapple with a bit in terms of the IUCN commissions, because the commissions are set up to be expert groups and it tends to be that you've been around a while if you're an expert. I think we were, suggested that we joined WCPA when we were in our sort of 40s as young members. So, we need to find better ways of bringing those youth ambassadors and those, all of these great people that are involved into the kind of the work of IUCN and its commissions.
Well, great. A couple of things. I mean, just one real quick, as I was thinking as you were talking, is that this whole idea of ramping up and scale, not just on Indigenous, but on everything we're doing, the high ambition that we need to achieve. We know what needs to be done. We have a lot of the science, and we have best practices, and we have small successes to celebrate. But we know that in the next 10 years, we've really got to ramp up. So that's going to be the big trend, not so much the qualitative, but the quantitative is essential. We know that. But overall, I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful that we'll soon make progress against some of these existential threats. Scientists have been warning us for years about climate change and biodiversity loss with too little effect. But now I think the message is getting through that we cannot continue with business as usual. Everyone around the world is feeling the heat, witnessing the fires, floods, and famine, seeing the changes quite personally and immediately. And now the pandemic has humbled us all and showed us what a small world we live in and depend on. More people are pushing for, or at least supportive of, significant reorientation of how we use and consume natural resources. And conservation is becoming more inclusive and mainstream, as we've talked about. We're learning that we can slow climate change and biodiversity loss if we follow the science, invest wisely, and put people to work on sustainable solutions to the needs of humans and nature, which ultimately are the same. And those of us working full-time in conservation are learning that yes, but is a better answer than always saying no. And as you've heard, we're bringing more diverse points of view into a bigger tent to find solutions to shared problems. And again, we're looking at critical decision points coming up with the climate conference in Glasgow this November and the biodiversity framework next spring in China. Neither of these is a first. This will be the COP15 on biodiversity and COP26 on climate. Conference of the Parties is the COP. We've been disappointed every time, not just because the targets and commitments were insufficient, but especially because the follow-through was woefully lacking. And this track record might make us doubt that these rounds will be any different. But I'm optimistic that we might have a different outcome this time. Like Nigel, I haven't seen this groundswell of support before. We might really make some progress because more and more people understand in very visceral, personal ways that we're facing a very scary future if we don't act now. Some of the science presented at the WCC should have made me despair. We have a colleague in Marine in particular who always startles me with some of his dire statistics. And at times I wanted to throw up my hands because of the depth of the problems and the severity of our situation. But seeing thousands of people hard at work and coming together around solutions, and knowing that millions more around the world are responding to the call for action, it just leaves me hopeful. And one hope is that we will one day look back at the 2021 IUCN World Conservation Congress as a turning point.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. We have time for a few final remarks to all of our panelists. Do you have a final message to share with the QLF alumni and friends who have joined with us today across the globe? What can we do one person at a time to make a difference in this world?
Should I start? Why not become a member of an IUCN commission? And if you become a member, do something. Quite a lot of the commissions have, it's very easy. It's fairly easy to sign up to become a member, but it's only really worth doing if you've got the time to. You have a little bit of time or a lot of time, but they're voluntary commissions, and they really are the heart and the soul of IUCN. A huge amount of the good work comes out from them. So yeah, my one message would be join a commission.
Thank you.
Shall I go next?
Sure.
I guess my message would be stamina. Keep at it. I mean, it's if you look at what on the scale of a human lifetime, things seem to be changing very slowly, and certainly when you're working on it day to day, things can be glacially slow, and we see reversals, and we see Bolsonaro in Brazil suddenly undoing lots of work, and we see Trump, and it's easy to get disheartened, but one of the things I've seen now in sort of 40 years of being involved in this is that there are gradual changes, and sometimes the changes take place quite quickly. I started doing this. I started working on renewable energy, and working on renewable energy in the 70s you were considered as totally crazy. I mean, off the wall. We were part of a small project building solar panels and wind power, and now it's mainstream, and it's easy to forget how much things have changed. Our attitudes to protected areas have changed dramatically. So I think for me, stamina, just keep it up. There'll be more reversals, more things going wrong, but it's just worth plugging away. Brent, you've been plugging away for years, like me.
Well, for me, I mean, we've all heard for years what individuals can do, right? Reduce, reuse, recycle, choose vehicles wisely and use them lightly, get your energy from the sun and the wind, not digging it out of the ground, etc. And we should do those things by all means, but frankly, we can no longer expect the voluntary actions of enlightened individuals to save us. We're out of time. We need systemic change, rapid transformations of energy and consumption economies. We need to invest in technical and nature-based solutions and put people to work to solve these problems. And we need leaders of the world to make major commitments at these critical treaty negotiations in November and May. So I think the best thing individuals can do right now is to make noise. Call your congressperson, call your senators, write your president or prime minister to demand commitments, and especially follow through. And then join a local action group and buy some solar panels.
Oh, thank you so much. On behalf of QLF, I extend my gratitude and heartfelt thanks to our panelists today for such an inspiring and informative discussion. And a special thanks to Brent Mitchell, also serving as our webinar host, and Bill Steelman, our webinar producer. And now we invite you to join episode 2 on Thursday, November 18th. We'll focus on QLF's long connection to pioneering conservation work in Belize. Joining us are QLF alumni who are prominent in the country's efforts to implement transformative policies for land conservation and marine protected areas. Meanwhile, stay well and stay in touch with us, and our best to you. Thank you.